Hello and welcome to our online group for August the 2nd of 2020. I am David Lockhart. You can see a picture of me over on the left, and we are starting a new series called In Search of Unity. And this first lesson is called A Critical Distraction. And this is about a lot of the social unrest issues that we see going on around us right now, and to really search for that unity in Christ that we all long for. So here is my outline for today. I'm going to start with just a word of caution, look at a few passages out of the Bible that kind of admonish us how we should address these sorts of issues, and briefly talk about why this matters, why it's important for us to address this topic. Then give you a little perspective on where my journey into this began. Why did I start reading about this, trying to learn about it? And then try and tell you what this particular lesson today is really about. Um, it's something that some people have coined contemporary critical theory, others have called it critical social justice. But Neil Shenvi really opened my eyes into all of this, how everything fits together, and you can see a link to his website there. So after going through a lot of books that are about racism, it became very clear to me that they're all connected. Um, that there were some forces, some guiding principles behind all of those that they shared in common. And Neil had already looked into this in detail and really helped me to understand what was going on there. And that's where I am going today, is to get you to the point where you can also understand all of this. So my words of caution. We just finished a study in Proverbs, and so much of that is applicable. Um, the first one is the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. Don't just listen to me. Check the facts and seek corroboration. That's what I've done, and I may not have done a perfect job. So double check me. And that's true of every piece of information that's out there. Secondly, come with a humble heart. Realize that you can be wrong. Don't be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, and if there's anything that you need to correct, turn away from it. Another thing is, we're talking about racial issues and they're emotionally charged. It's so easy to get worked up, but we need to strive to remain calm. Don't be hot-tempered. That just is going to stir up even more anger and strife. So please try to be slow to anger and quiet the contention. Try to use the soft answer that we know works wonders in turning away wrath, and avoid those harsh words. And try to be slow to speak. Don't be hasty. It says here that there's more hope for a fool than somebody who speaks rashly. So let's hear some instruction. Let's try to be wise and not neglect it. Now, in the issues that we are hearing about today, I think both sides have got some issues they need to deal with. On the one side, there's a lot of people who just are in complete denial that anything wrong ever occurred, and it definitely isn't occurring now. They're just concealing transgressions. The Bible says you're not going to prosper doing that. Confess, forsake, obtain mercy. But on the other side, even when somebody says, yes, there was something wrong, or there's even something wrong now, they just keep repeating the matter. They refuse to cover an offense, even when the person has admitted to the wrongdoing. And that just separates. And what we're after here today is unity, not separation. Now, we also need to make sure that we're looking to true wisdom, true knowledge, because there are a lot of fools who are pouring out folly right now. But we know that God is wise. He's the one who gave us Proverbs, and we need to seek his counsel first and foremost. So when you see information that is contradictory, go to the ultimate source of truth first, and that's God and his scriptures. We also need to remember that God hates pride, a lying tongue, which leads often to sowing that discord. So let's try and work on that unity. Let's avoid trying to say something that might further our position when we know it isn't the whole truth. So let's strive for that honesty in this discussion. So why does this matter? Well, unity in Christ is not optional. So there's two passages here, one out of Galatians. It says there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. There is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. One. And out of Colossians, again, not Greek or Jew, not circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. We all get Christ in equal measure, and we are equal before Christ. And so we should be equal with each other, and that should be a uniting thing. We also need to recognize that racism exists, and it is a sin. So I just looked it up in a dictionary. A belief or a doctrine that inherent differences among the various human racial groups determine cultural or individual achievement, usually involving the idea that one's own race is superior and has the right to dominate others, and that a particular racial group is inferior to others. So the superior inferior, that's the crux of the evil that's in here. Now, it also talks about a policy system of government that's based on fostering such a doctrine, discrimination. But, often we think of hatred, intolerance, some sort of bias, prejudice against another race or races. And that really comes from, again, this idea of superiority and inferiority. So clearly the Bible says that hatred, discrimination based on heritage, gender, social status, cultural background, it's a sin. And therefore, if we see it in ourselves or anyone else, we need to address it. And look what Peter said in Acts chapter 10. He opened his mouth and said, "Truly I understand that God shows no partiality." And what are we supposed to strive for? Walking like God. And to walk like God means we too need to show no partiality. Now, my view, this is just David Lockard speaking. From the research that I have done, from what I knew previously, I've certainly learned a lot over the past couple of months, but not too much of it has just been completely eye-opening, shocking. But it's very clear that there has been a lot of historical abuse of blacks in many other groups, and we just shouldn't ignore it. And many of the darkest stories that are being shared, circulated right now, they're true. And we just shouldn't deny it. But to me, one of the key points is that discrimination is still occurring today. These are things that we need to be addressing. And a simple example is just this one about resumes. People with a black sounding name are 50% less likely to receive an inquiry about a submitted resume. And that's just because their name sounds black, like Jaquan as opposed to David. That's discrimination. Why does that still exist, and what can we do about it? And there are many, many, many more examples that we need to discuss, but there just isn't enough time today because I need to get to and through this important topic. But as we go through these 4 weeks, future lessons will be focused on this topic. If we want to achieve unity, then we need to work on eliminating discrimination and racism. Now, I also say this is going to be complicated. It's often oversimplified. The causes of it, who accepted it, who was complicit, who benefited, who was hurt, what are the ramifications? They're all complicated topics. And then, what you really want to address is stopping the racist acts and policies. Even this can be complicated. in terms of things like policies, depending on what your definition is of racism. And we'll get into that today. So I'm not going to say that we're going to come up with any easy answers on how to solve this issue. We're not. But that doesn't mean that we can't take some meaningful and positive steps forward. So in terms of the history question, why is it important? Well, a lot of people are familiar with the old saying, that if you don't know history, then you're doomed to repeat it. Something that Winston Churchill said. Well, originally came from this guy, George Santayana. Very similar type of statement. If you can't remember the past, you're condemned to repeat it. Well, the issue is that history shows that even people who know history repeat it, which is what this one particular link talks about. So the important thing is not just learning the history, but learning from history. And that's much more difficult. And that's what the goal has got to be. Identify what the problems were and then identify ways to make sure that we don't repeat those problems. You can see, there's other statements here. We may be simply given to certain irrationality, sinful behavior, which leads us down paths, some disastrous, again and again. And when we talk about even our own personal sin that nobody even knows about, isn't that true? But just because we're inclined to sin doesn't mean we can't take meaningful steps to stop it. And often that involves getting other people involved. I like the quote by Mark Twain about this. He certainly realized that people learn about history and repeat it. So he said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So once we acknowledge that we do have something to learn, still there's the question of, why do you want to listen to me? And why would I even research this topic? Well, frankly, I would prefer that you do go and just research this yourself. Like I said in the very beginning, the research I've done may have been faulty in some way. So corroborate me, find other sources, do some homework yourself. But I'm also well aware that some of you won't. And there's some important information that I hope to be able to share with you that will at least make you aware and maybe motivate you to go and do some research yourself. And why now? Well, obviously, with all the protests and things going on, this is really something that's been a long time coming. So all the dates here that are in bold, these are incidences where police were involved in tragic deaths. The one on February 23rd with Ahmaud Arbery, that was some private citizens who did it. But these are all people of color, blacks, who were killed. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. But certainly the 9-minute video, George Floyd's death, just energized a lot of people to try and bring about some sort of change. There's been a lot of tragedy, and we need to acknowledge that that tragedy is real, and we need to see what we need to do about it. So the other thing that got me motivated was social media, and I hardly ever am on social media, but I do have a LinkedIn account, and a friend shared this particular post. And what got me was the tone about it, some of the words that were in it. It's just, I'm not interested in anything except racist issues, racism. And she used a lot of these words here, that are keywords: allies, advocates, accomplices, biases. And then the way she closed it, your tone-deaf connections regarding selling your products, services are peak examples of white privilege in a week that's taken a toll on us. And this was the week of George Floyd's death. I wasn't even sure what my white privilege was, and the whole tone of this particular message just seemed to be so angry, and I didn't understand, and I was trying to understand. So obviously the first step is getting educated. Get some background, read diversely. These are just a sampling of some of the books that I went through that are on the topic. Also looked at a lot of just articles that you can find on the internet. I don't know that I recommend all of these books. The first one, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, seemed to connect with the LinkedIn post that I just shared with you. But it's actually written by a woman who's from the UK. And what I really learned from that book is all of the issues that we are dealing with here in the United States, they're dealing with in the UK and everywhere else in the world. So it's by no means unique what we have going on here in the US. The next two by Kendi. This first one is just a very long tome about the history, definitive history of racist ideas in America, and then how to be an anti-racist. These next two, Color of Law and Just Mercy, I want to spend a lot of time discussing with you, but we'll not get to those today. The Color of Compromise, I actually did not read the book, but there's a video series on Right Now Media that he put together, and I watched all of that. And it truly is just history. There's very little Bible about it. That's one of the reasons I chose not to use that for our study. I think it's important to learn the history, but I think that we're making a mistake if we don't bring the Bible into everything. And that study almost does nothing in terms of giving you some biblical context for all of this. It's just pure history. This next one is not a book about race issues at all, at least not on the surface. It just happened to be what I was reading at the time. But by Dan Ariely, it's called Predictably Irrational. And it says the hidden forces that shape our decisions. And he is a psychological economist. But what was very interesting in the book is he brought out a lot of the economic issues that we see, that they aren't necessarily about whites and blacks, but more about rich and poor, and how there are hidden forces, decisions that are being made, sometimes subconscious, sometimes conscious, that are being used in discrimination today. So I thought I'd still put it up here just because it's kind of connected. And then finally, White Fragility, which was probably the hardest book I've ever tried to read in my life. So what did I learn? Well, the long history of racism is certainly ugly, and we do need to learn about this. Make sure you're listening, you're slow to anger and slow to speak, because there is a lot to learn. And I don't want to go through some exhaustive study on all of this, but I recommend that you go and read diversely on this subject if you aren't already at least somewhat aware. What I'm going to give you in the next few minutes is just a brief overview, just to show you how ugly it was, so that you don't just take some broad brush and ignore it. In 1955 in Mississippi, the Reverend George Lee, he was the first black to register to vote in Humphreys County since Reconstruction. He was shot to death for refusing to remove his name from the voter rolls. Then on August 13th, World War I veteran Lamar Smith was shot dead in front of the Lincoln County Courthouse for encouraging other blacks to vote. So much of the tyranny, basically, that was going on in Mississippi around this time had to do with voting. The other thing had to do with interracial relationships. So on August 28th, Emmett Till, who was from the North, he was just visiting, he was murdered by Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam for allegedly whistling at Bryant's wife. They brutally beat him, shot him in the head, and threw his body into the Tallahatchie River with a large metal fan tied around his neck with barbed wire. His mother decided to have an open casket ceremony to allow the world to see what these people had done to her son. Now I'm going to show you a picture from that on the next slide. So, if you want to turn away, feel free to do so. So this is a picture of Emmett Till before and after this brutal event. The reason this was such a landmark event in the United States is this is what prompted the federal law against the lynching. So you may be saying that that's just an isolated incident, or just those are some bad apples. That's really not the right way to think about it. Let's look at the data. So this is a photo taken in Owensboro, Kentucky in 1936, where they were carrying out a public execution. And you can see the huge crowd of people who are there observing this. This is taken from the Equal Justice Initiative website, and they have documented over 4,000 lynchings that occurred in the South, and they even found 300 to 400 that were in the North. So these aren't isolated incidences, and many of them were done to terrorize, to control the population. This is what could happen to you, and predominantly it was blacks, almost exclusively it was blacks. Now you also may be saying that, well, those are the sinful people, those are the non-Christian people. In The Color of Compromise by Jemar Tisby, he records a particular lynching where it was done on a Sunday afternoon for the particular reason of getting a larger crowd. People coming out from church could go and watch it. Now, it's true that in this case, the lynching of Luther and Mary Holbert was occurring because Luther was a suspect in a murder. But there was no trial, no jury. There's just a couple of private citizens who decided because this was a black man who killed a white guy, they were going to lynch him. But, lynching isn't just hanging. This is fiendish tortures. So first they cut off fingers and toes and handed them out as souvenirs. Then they beat the bodies such that Luther's eyes dangled from its socket. And then the worst thing was they gave the crowd a large corkscrew. And then this was bored into the flesh of the man and the woman in their arms, legs, and body, and then pulled out. And then finally they burned Mary first so that Luther could see his beloved killed. Then they burned him. And the men who did this, Woods Eastland, who led the mob, he did face charges, but it was a foregone conclusion that he would be acquitted by the all-white jury, and he was released. And he even held a party on his plantation to celebrate. So, keep in mind that even though Christians were around, they were watching these sorts of events, sometimes even participating in them. But this really shouldn't be that surprising to us. What does the Bible say about us as human beings? In Jeremiah, it says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Humans are really good at inventing new ways to sin, to be evil. And just because somebody claims to be religious, it does not make them righteous. Look at this passage out of Matthew where Jesus is talking to the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, and he just calls them hypocrites, whitewashed tombs that appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and uncleanness. They are serpents, broods of vipers, and how can they escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore, I indeed send you prophets, wise men, and scribes, and some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zachariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. So the people claiming to be religious for a time immemorial have still participated in these sorts of atrocities. But you still might be thinking, well, that was just so far out. How could somebody participate in that? Well, these books I read, they were asking the same question, and they came to the conclusion that there's this unique white evil because they were the ones who were perpetrating these atrocities. And they grasped whatever explanations they could come up with, including we're aliens. We're from another planet, and that's how we got to be so evil. Another one is a story that was popularized by the Nation of Islam. So it's the story of Yaqub. And you can look it up on Wikipedia if you want to, but basically it's a origin story for the races. Originally we were all black, but then there was this scientist Yaqub, and he and his followers, left. They went to the isle in the Aegean Sea called Pilon, and they used eugenics for 600 years to selectively breed the white race. And the brutal conditions there of their creation determined their evil nature. And eventually they migrated out from there, lived as beasts and as barbarians for a while. But then they used this technology to usurp power and enslave the black population, and then brought the first slaves to America. But anyway, people will grasp onto this just because they're trying to come up with some explanation for how evil white people are and how they have done these atrocities. But the reality is that evil, that sin, is what humanity has in common, and it crosses all ethnic and racial bounds. If you want to have a study on how quickly humans can descend into dehumanizing behavior, so maybe not to the extent of the lynchings, but something close, consider the Stanford Prison Experiment. I've got the link there, www.prisonexp.org. But it only took 1 week for a bunch of college kids to degrade into this mentality where, and it was basically split into prison officers and prisoners. And the prison officers, some of them just very quickly dropped into this role where they forced the prisoners to do some things that weren't too different from what you saw in Abu Ghraib. So it's not unique. We are all capable of sinking into this kind of behavior. And we also have to realize that slavery's been around for almost as long as humanity has. If you look it up, and this is just something I got from Wikipedia, it just says there's evidence of slavery that predates written records, and it's existed in many cultures. And here they list a lot of them, and many of them are going to be familiar to you if you've ever read your Bible. The Jews were enslaved in Egypt. They were also enslaved by the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans. And, what we're familiar with here in the United States, the slavery of Africans. It was actually the Islamic Caliphate that the Europeans copied and expanded upon what they had started. But, this idea of superiority that sort of justifies the enslavement, it's pervasive. I remember when I was in college, I took a couple of classes on the Japanese mind, and they've got a special story about how they were dripped from the spear of the gods, and that's why they were so special. And their god, their emperor himself was a god. It wasn't until after World War II that notion was dispelled because they had been defeated. And that was, part of that theology basically is what justified how they were so brutal to all the peoples around them, the Koreans, even other Oriental peoples. We can't even tell them apart, but they certainly could, and they were brutal to them. So, this is all common to man. This is what links us. It's truly our capacity for this sin. Another example is Adolf Eichmann. So in 1914, he was working for his father's mining company in Austria. Worked there for a while, and then as a traveling oil salesman beginning in 1927, and then joined the Nazi Party and the SS in 1932. Returned to Germany, joined their secret service, where he was appointed to be head of the department responsible for Jewish affairs, especially immigration, which the Nazis encouraged through violence and economic pressure. So he's just kind of sliding into this. Well, after the outbreak of war, he and his staff arranged for Jews to be concentrated in ghettos in major cities, with the thought that they would be transported to the edges of the empire to the east or overseas. But then, in 1941, change in policy. Instead of immigration, it's extermination. And he just dutifully did what he was told. So his staff became responsible for deportations to extermination camps, in particular for those from Hungary. And by 1944, 437,000 of Hungary's 725,000 Jews had been killed. Now think about that number, 437,000. We're in the midst of this pandemic right now, and think of the number of deaths we've had from COVID-19 compared with this, just from Hungary. Well, after the war, he actually escaped. He lived in Europe for a little while, and then he made it to Argentina, but he was tracked down in 1960 by the Mossad. Now, here's the part that's interesting and I wanted to get you to. So, at the trial, someone said that Eichmann had told them that he would leap laughing into the grave because the feeling that he had 5 million people on his conscience would be for him a source of extraordinary satisfaction. How can anybody think that? But at the same time, during the trial, he did not, even though he didn't deny the Holocaust or his role in it, he claimed he was simply following orders in a totalitarian system, just doing what his bosses told them. But what was most interesting is the observations of some Holocaust survivors like Hannah Arendt, who wrote a book about him. And she's the one that coined the phrase, the banality of evil, to describe him. He was ordinary. She was expecting, a devil, the Prince of Darkness, a troll, a vampire. But she described him as being just like any other bureaucrat. There was nothing special about him. What we really need to realize is it's very easy for any of us to slip into this sort of extraordinarily horrific behavior because we're human. Now, those books didn't emphasize this too much, but I just wanted to remind everybody because they do bring up economics quite a bit, and they talk about the rich and the poor. That that in the United States we do have a very top-heavy group. At 20%, top 20% has nearly 88% of the wealth in the United States, and these are estimates. This is from 2017, and it's also hard to estimate these things, but what's clear is that we are deviating from the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. So Pareto was an Italian mathematician, and at one point he was charged with figuring out in the country how much of the land was owned by different groups. And what he found was 80% of the land was owned by 20% of the people. And what has been found since then is that is pretty much the way wealth is distributed everywhere in a normal functioning economy. But also 20% of results tend to be from 20% of the effort. Even at Liberty Baptist Church, it basically functions where 80% of the revenue that they bring in comes from 20% of the people who attend. But what the United States is currently doing is deviating from this rule, and that may have consequences. If you're more into looking at things visually, this just shows you how the bottom 40% owns this little tiny tip of the United States if land mass were used to represent wealth. So, the top 10% would have this, the top 20, this is the top 10%, and this is the top 20%. So that's 80% of the United States here. Another point of emphasis that some of the books make is that the inequality in income and wealth is actually concentrated in the South. So in this plot, red is the highest level of inequality, and you can see that it is concentrated more in the South. And they say that this is a consequence of Jim Crow and segregation, which was certainly much more concentrated in the South. What they also talk a lot about is that it's not just within the United States, it's the United States compared with the world. And so this kind of soccer ball is a representation of wealth in the world. And from 2019, you can see the estimate was the United States had $106 trillion in wealth, or about almost a third of the world's wealth. And so we are the group with the most wealth, the most power in the world. So after reading those books and also doing some research on the internet, really it kind of left me confused. There is a dictionary, a lexicon that they use that I found confusing. There are a lot of conflicting definitions, and it also made me feel trapped. They redefine a lot of things. So racism, we often think of as just bias, ill will, or categorizing people as superior, inferior. Well, one of the definitions that you will find when you start looking at this in more detail is no, yes, it is that bias, ill will, prejudice, but you have to have power. If you don't have power, you don't have racism. There's also a heavy emphasis on the group, not the individual. So even though I individually may express some, racist statement or do something that's overtly racist, they emphasize things that impact the group, which would be more like policy. So one who supports a racist policy through their actions or inaction, or expressing a racist idea in any way, that's racism. And any way means biologically, culturally, or behaviorally. And I didn't see how you could even function when you use that sort of a definition, because everybody's racist then, which is fine with them. But it just leaves no room for the truth if it's just what they don't want to hear. So, I ran competitively for a number of years, but I can tell you, I was never anywhere near as good as a Kenyan. And I've talked to medical doctors who have looked at them, and they just say they've got perfect hearts and perfect lungs. And if you look at their physique, it's just made for distance running. But for me to say that, they are superior runners, they're just built for it, I would be racist. I could also say that Asians are better at math, because when you do studies, you find out that Asian kids do 2 hours of homework per day. But to say that they're advantaged in that way based on this definition is racist. Now, I will say I can understand their apprehension to allow somebody to say something like that, because it goes back to this, if you're expressing superiority or inferiority, you're doing something wrong. But the problem is it leaves no room for the truth. And just because a Kenyan might have some genetic benefit for running, it doesn't mean that nobody could beat a Kenyan. We know that that's not true. It just means they have a statistically higher probability that they would be a good runner. There are even Kenyans who aren't good runners. In fact, it's not just Kenyans, it's Kenyans who live in the mountains. It's a particular tribe Kenyans who live in the valleys, they're stocky, they're good sprinters. But if we go based on this definition that they want to have, we can't even have these sorts of conversations. But that means we can't get to the truth. And that's part of why I felt trapped, but the next part is where I really felt like they're trapping me. Because you are either racist or anti-racist. There's no neutrality. So you've got this problem. If you don't admit you're a racist, that you're expressing racist ideas, that there is a problem with racism, then you're expressing fragility. It's some sort of discomfort or defensiveness when you're confronted by this information about the inequality and injustice, or you're exhibiting either a conscious or subconscious denial of your privilege because you're in the privileged group. Like I'm a white male, so I'm privileged, and I'm just trying to maintain my power and ideas. So I can't even say anything that contradicts what they are because it just shows that I'm being fragile or trying to maintain my power. I can't even have the conversation since I'm trapped. So what did I notice? There are just similar themes and terminology in all of these books. And many of them are coming out of academic circles, from sociology departments, from African American studies, and not just these books, but things I was reading on the internet, and then how pervasive it was. It became obvious that this isn't just some isolated thing. Now, the last of the books that I picked up was Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, and I just talked a little bit about what fragility is all about. And I've got to admit, that's probably the hardest book I've ever tried to read. And I at least stopped when I got to where it attempted to get me to embrace white supremacy. And it wasn't the first time I had read something that tried to get me to embrace white supremacy. Now, I will say that they do redefine that term, so it's not necessarily a skinhead, a neo-Nazi, or the KKK. But the problem I have is they're trying to get me to embrace a term that I have already associated with people who do those terrible things. So even if they've redefined it, and I would say, yes, okay, I have had some of the behaviors that you're talking about, I don't want to associate it with a word that in my mind is already connected with awful behavior. In psychology, gaslighting, and maybe this is a variant of it, but it's a tactic in which a person or entity, in order to gain more power, makes a victim question their reality. And I think that all of these redefinitions of terms are basically doing that. Now, I'm not alone in thinking that this book is tough to read. Founders.org, I've already mentioned that before, but they've got a review here on that book by Samuel Say, who is a black man. And I've just got a couple of his comments here. But he also says that it was the worst book he's ever read, and he felt like he lost 4 days in doing it. But he also makes the point that all of this stuff does not mention God, but they have gods of anti-racism, and they've got these super anti-racists like Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book, who are kind of the precious deities that we must devote ourselves to. And if we don't want to be racists, or if you don't want to internalize racism, he's a black man, then we have to worship at their feet. And then he brings up this other term: social justice is an unending burden and pain no one can bear. So to live up to their standards of anti-racism, it's a standard no one can actually achieve. And though, a lot of these books, they even admit it, they still have racist ideas. But, contrast that with Jesus. His yoke is easy, his burden is light. But I would certainly agree with his final statement. If you embrace white fragility and all of this anti-racism, you're in danger of losing your mind and your soul. So in going through all of this and starting to search more on the particular terms that I had seen, looking at social justice, I came across this, Neil Shenvi. So there was a presentation that he gave at Southeastern Seminary, and this is a link for it. And I'll have more to talk about all of his work in just a second. But he has been researching this for a number of years, read many books on the topic, given presentations on it, and he put all the pieces together for me. All right, and that's what we're going to talk a lot about. But to just show you how balanced he is in his approach, in this particular article, he says if we had to recommend just one book at the popular level that demonstrates critical theory in action, and critical theory is what is behind this social justice idea and all this terminology, they recommend this book, White Fragility. And he said it's essential reading for anyone trying to understand the basic ideas and methods. So even if it's a difficult read, it helps us to at least get a grasp on all that's going on. Now, he also thinks it's a tough book with a lot of crazy ideas, and he has a lot of quotes from the book that he has, that book and other writings from Robin DiAngelo on his website. So another place that we see a strong influence of, all of this social justice critical theory is in the Black Lives Matter political movement. And it's also employing that same sort of tactic of sort of redefining things. I mean, all of us would affirm Black Lives Matter, but now it's a political movement. It's not just a statement. But if you go to their website, and everything you've got here, it is just taken directly from their website. And I will tell you that I looked at this a couple of months ago, their website, and they've cleaned and sanitized this quite a bit. So it's not quite as overt, and yet it's still pretty clear. But if you look here at their website and a lot of the terminology that they're using, it's the same sort of thing that you see in all of these other social justice critical theory books. So they talk about liberation and justice, they talk about eradicating white supremacy, and it's all about power that's been inflicted by the state. Power inflicted by the state. That's key theme. Now, you would think Black Lives Matter would just be about black liberation, but no. Okay, it's social, economic, it's political. And yes, it's about the police brutality and justice in that area, but it extends into sexual identity, gender expression, economic status, disability, religious beliefs, immigration status, location, and location also includes things like global warming. And they talk about spaces, dismantling cisgender privilege, violence, men-centered, having queer forming networks, freeing, again, all of these buzzwords from social justice. And then, finally, they talk about dismantling that patriarchal practice that requires mothers to work and disrupting the Western prescribed nuclear family structure. Now, many of the issues that they have raised are legitimate, and the causes are ones that we need to investigate. And, just like right here, ageism. Who of us is going to say that speaking up for the old, for our elders, is a bad thing? Discrimination because people are old. No, we are for that. We are for Black lives. We are for many of the things that they are concerned about. But there are many that we are not. Right here, they want to disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure. God has told us what the family structure is supposed to be, and we affirm that. But what's more important for what we're going to talk about today is what is the underlying really theology behind how they want to go about achieving all of these goals, and how has that affected the church. So how do we even deal with something like Black Lives Matter? Hopefully by the end of all of this, you'll have a clearer idea, but just let me say right now, if you're going to say Black Lives Matter, make sure that the other person knows what you're saying, that you're not making a political statement, you're not supporting the political entity. My policy is don't use words that others have redefined. And you may choose to, that's up to you, but just make sure your statements are clear. But what I prefer to do is say Black people are precious, they are valued, and they are loved. Because that humanizes them by saying people. It's not just a life. My cat was a life, had a life. And it's not just that they matter, it elevates their worth. Okay, they are valued, they're precious and loved. But this also, it brings us to the point where we have to ask ourselves, can we really say that and believe it and live it out? Did Jesus live it out? Of course he did. And that's a standard that we need to hold ourselves to. So why does all of this really matter now? What we've been talking about, social justice. Well, this is where we're really going to get into it. So at the top is a definition for religion. Now I've highlighted what's kind of key here is normally we associate it with some sort of superhuman agency or agencies. If you take that out, you're basically left with a worldview or ideology. So, the Christian religion has a worldview and an ideology. It just also happens to have a superhuman agency, God. But if you take God out of the picture, you can still have this worldview or ideology. It's a body of doctrine, myths, or beliefs that guides an individual's social movement, institution, class, or large group. That's exactly what we see in social justice and contemporary critical theory. So here are some of the social justice terms, and I just got these by Googling social justice dictionary university, and this is one of the first ones that was there, but just about every university you can think of is going to have a list that's like this. But if you start looking at these words and you look at the definitions that they have for them, because that's the purpose of having these dictionaries, is so students can look them up. So if you look at all that terminology that they have and you look at the definitions, you can actually see where they have created a worldview out of it. And we'll look at these in a little more in detail, but just kind of a summary of where we're going. In Christianity, we have God, the supreme being, omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, and he prescribes everything. It's top down. Well, they call that hegemonic power. We talk about original sin. To them, sin is having privilege or expressing racism. Christianity emphasizes individual responsibility. Yes, there are some group dynamics, but each of us is condemned because of our own sin, and each of us is saved if we accept Christ personally. With them, it's all about the group. We talk about being saved, they talk about being liberated. We say we're born again, they say you are woke. We talk about being redeemed and atoned, they say you're an anti-racist and an activist. We talk about a new heaven and a new earth, they talk about achieving equity. We talk about the church, they talk about having safe spaces. In our church is the body of Christ, they have allies. We talk about blasphemy and heretical teaching. They talk about politically incorrect and problematic teaching. And then finally, we speak of objective truth that all transcends from God. And this is the idea of scientific universality. You know, there is a truth, there is an unchangingness to the universe, and the science helps us to understand that and learn that. In critical social justice theory, they use the standpoint theory, which really says there's no objective reality. So it's more about your experiences than any objective truth. So I think, you know, you'll understand more hopefully in, you know, the next few minutes. But I, I think just from this, you should see that they are very much contradictory, these two worldviews. So it's not just people on the religious side who are saying that critical theory is akin to a worldview or, you know, a type of religion. This is an article that I found from you know, just some sociologists, and you know, they said that social justice is rooted in social constructionism. So basically, they are building core beliefs, and you know, they can diverge as much as they want from science, you know, that no objective truth, no objective reality, and they use this critical theory, which we're going to talk about in detail soon. And that's the tool which anybody in academia can build up this new worldview. And you know, there's no guru, no god, no priest. It's just people going through a PhD program and writing some papers that are building this worldview. And to promulgate, to spread their new religion, they put their concepts into the mainstream, you know, dictionary, our common vocabulary, by redefining common words with specific meanings relevant to their program, such as inclusive, meaning exclusive of certain views, and the stealth change of equality, meaning equality of opportunity, into equity, which is referring to outcomes. And you can find these terms all over the place if you just look. So now we're actually going to dig into what is this critical theory behind the critical social justice movement. And again, I have to give credit where it's due. Neil Shenvi is the one that kind of tied all of these threads together for me. Got lots of links to his website, Facebook page, a couple of interviews, the presentations that he has given. There's just a lot more material than I could possibly go through. So if you want to dig deeper, go there. I'll have the links below for you. So let's dig into what he found. So what is critical theory? Now, it does draw heavily on Marxist ideas, but not economic, although, you know, there are some aspects of that. You know, one of the books that I read said that capitalism is the conjoined twin of racism. So there are connections, but it's not primarily about that. And for critical theory, what they really drew upon were Marxist ideas about how power circulates and functions in society, especially those to reproduce inequality and exploitation. Okay, so it's that's the primary thing behind critical theory: power and how it produces inequality and exploitation, and how do you change that. The particular term was only coined in the 1930s by a group of sociologists and philosophers known as the Frankfurt School, and they actually came to the United States before the outbreak of war. And they extended Marx's ideas into understanding how domination is produced by things like culture and mass media. Now, just because you're seeing something like that, I think, oh, they're terrible. They're figuring out insidious ways to do stuff. We use culture and mass media to also try and spread the gospel. So, you know, the fact that they're trying to use these particular tools shouldn't be that alarming to us, but we should be aware that they are doing that. Now, critical theory has expanded and evolved tremendously since then. all these different areas: post-colonialism, critical pedagogy, postmodernism, feminism, black feminism, queer theory, critical race theory. They've all built upon this construct. Okay, so that was just the beginnings of all of these other areas that have built upon it. And again, as we saw, that the social justice movement, it's just a bunch of guys with PhDs kind of inventing their worldview. So now we're going to get into some of the critical concepts behind this theory. And the first one is the social binary. It's the idea that society can be divided into a dominant or oppressor group and a subordinate or oppressed group. Now, what you divide it along is up to you. Race, class, gender, sexuality, wealth, disabilities, religion, all of these have been used in critical theory. And there's an image here out of this book from Maurianne Adams. She was an editor. It's called Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice from 2007. So remember, this stuff's been around for a long time. And Rutledge had an article in there, and this is his matrix of oppression. So you can see, if we look at the category of race, the privileged group is the white people. The border group are biracial people, maybe Asians. And then the targeted group, blacks, Native Americans, possibly Latinos and Asians. And this we call racism. So the white people are in power and they're oppressing those that are in this group. So we've got the binary, two: privileged, oppressors, and then the oppressed group. They also have this idea of intersectionality. So our identities are complex and can't be understood along a single axis or group. In other words, we just talked about race a second ago, but you could be a black man and you're only oppressed because you are black. But if you are a black woman, you could be oppressed for being black and for being a female. And you can see that playing out in some signs that were in a 2017 Women's March. It said, "Don't forget, white women voted for Trump." And feminism without intersectionality, this exact word, is just white supremacy. So in other words, you can't assume that white women and women of color will share the same agenda, because women of color are oppressed in a way that white women are not. So the more oppressed groups that you're in, sort of better off you are in this sort of theory. Now, we've already seen this word, hegemonic power. Robin DiAngelo, in Is Everyone Equal? She wrote that it refers to the control of the ideology of society. The dominant group maintains power by imposing their ideology on everyone. So normally we would think of oppression, if you look it up in a dictionary, it's going to talk about acts of cruelty, injustice, violence, coercion. But now oppression is being defined as ways in which the dominant social group imposes its norms, values, and ideas on society to justify or to further its own interests. And if you've got hegemonic power, you're able to do that, to impose those norms, values, and ideas. Now, dominance and the ability to oppress is not numerical, all right? Because if you look at the category old white men, who are the most dominant, that only makes up about 15% of the population. In fact, there are fewer men than women, but men oppress women. It's who's got the power. And they're dominant because they're imposing their old white male ideology on everyone else. And if you accept these values as natural, objective, and common sense, then you've been blinded and you need to be woken up, because They're really just serving the old white male interests. So that's the objective, is to get people awake to the idea that there is this hegemonic power that is oppressing them. Now, the third main concept is this one of lived experience. Now, it argues that a lived experience gives the oppressed people special access to truths about their oppression. So here's what Jose Medina says in Epistemology of Resistance. Dominant groups characteristically have experiences that foster illusory perceptions about society's functioning, whereas subordinate groups characteristically have experience that, at least potentially, give rise to more adequate conceptualizations. So in other words, privileged people, I'm a white male, I'm definitely privileged and old too, I tend to be blinded by my privilege. Therefore, anything that I say is tainted or corrupted by that. So you can just ignore anything that I say. Now, you can have somebody who's oppressed who goes along with what the white guy says, but that's internalized oppression. So they're embracing the ideology of the dominant group, failing to see that I'm imposing it upon them. It's just my bid for power. This plays into this idea of objectivity. So you can see here, Collins said in Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory, the idea that objectivity is best reached only through rational thought is a specifically Western and masculine way of thinking, one that we will challenge throughout this book. So you can see the difficulty that they have placed us in. They've just said that if I want to have a logical, rational conversation about something, they've thrown that out. What is important is people's lived experiences, in particular, the lived experiences of the oppressed group. That's the problem. Now, it is certainly true that as a white male, I am not going to be able to fully understand the experiences of, say, a black woman who's having a baby. And she can speak more authoritatively about that experience as a black woman having a baby. But that doesn't mean that I can have no meaningful, logical thoughts about that. And that doesn't mean that we can't have some commonality in some other area that unites us even more than our race, our gender, and the fact that she had a baby separates us. And that's kind of the crux of the problem that we have here with this lived experience idea. Now, finally, it's social justice. And one commentator that I read, he said that it's a nearly perfect branding of critical theory. It's just like the phrase Black Lives Matter. It's nearly a perfect branding. If you went around talking about critical theory, people go, what? But people say social justice. And you think, well, of course I'm for that. Social, people, yeah. And then justice, yeah, we want to be right and honorable and, give people their just rewards, whether it be, for merits, we live in a meritocracy. You work hard, you earn. Of course, I'm for social justice. That has absolutely nothing to do with what they're talking about. It's the elimination of all forms of social oppression. Again, based on that long list: gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, physical, mental ability, or economic class. Now, I would also say that I don't like the idea of oppression either. So, I might be, okay, well, that's okay too. I just want to get rid of oppression. But it's also the analysis of how power, privilege, and oppression impact us in our experiences and our social identities. Your identity becomes your identity in these groups and the intersectionality and how many groups you've got. And again, we keep going deeper and deeper into this, which becomes a worldview. So it's all about getting to the point where we can have a redistribution of the resources that is equitable, and all members of a space, community, or institution or society are physically and psychologically safe and secure. How do you get to the proper redistribution? You have to get the power. Well, how do you get the power? You either convince those in power to do what you want, or you take it. Now, it also, we've already talked about this stratification, this binary. We've got the oppressors and the oppressed, and that divides us, and it says that we're unequal in significant and far-reaching ways along these groups that they have defined. And the goal is to change this. So really, end state, it's state redistribution of advantages and resources to disadvantaged groups to satisfy their group right to equality of outcome. Now, again, let me say that many of the issues that they bring up are important ones that we need to address. The problem is how they want to address them and this worldview that's behind all of it. So again, the mission of social justice is to identify these disadvantaged groups. Again, it's not numerical. Then assess outcomes, because the emphasis on equality is on outcome, not opportunity. Then see who has the resources and the power, and if they've got them, pretty much it's unjust. That's the given. Now, they do emphasize that an individual may have achieved equitably, but the group cannot. So they allow for you as an individual to be an exception, but the rule always applies to the group. So economically, you can think my parents both were dirt poor growing up, and they made it into the middle class. So they've achieved equitably, although they would still say that they benefited some from white privilege. But the group, white, definitely did it inequitably. So they assign blame for those group outcomes and then seek to redistribute the resources. So one area that they strongly emphasize is LGBTQA plus rights. And I keep wondering how many letters they're going to put on there. But that A stands for allies, which is one of those terms that we ran across before. So if you're anti-racist, you must be an ally, and you must actively try to change the laws, the policies that are out there. And this is really a success story for the social justice movement. And there was even a book that was written back in the 90s called After the Ball that said this is how we are going to go about changing all of these policies, changing how people feel. It recognized that they had to use what power they did have to influence future ideas and policy. And where they could have influence was in television, in movies, and in education. And they used that to make people see gay behavior. So they just became desensitized to it and got used to it. And again, this idea of language confusion. So changing what things mean. So how many times have you heard sodomy? It just isn't in our lexicon anymore. They just eliminated it. Instead, we have gay, which used to mean happy. And queer used to mean odd. Now, you can, other things, culture jamming is another psychology term, probably using some of that as well. But it's just, shaking up your everyday life. And when you're shaken up, when things are just not so that you could process, you're much more likely to accept something that's different because your reality is so confused. But the end goal is to wake you up so that you can be a convert, which means you become an ally, you identify gays as an oppressed group, and then you actively work, at the very least vote, to help them change policy. And they've done it. Now they do have quandaries because with all of these groups, with all of this intersectionality, there's always going to be conflict in even in the groups that they call oppressed. You know, what one oppressed group wants may further oppress another group. One example, and I'm just using this as an example of that quandary, would be the idea of abortion. It disproportionately prevents the life of poor black females. Well, you're poor, you're black, and I've chosen females just because more than half of the babies born are female. But that picks out 3 of their oppressed groups. And, if you look at a place like New York City, over half of the pregnancies of black women in New York end in abortion. You also have the rather ironic issue of Planned Parenthood. Most of the abortions, Planned Parenthood participates in some way. That founder, Margaret Sanger, she promoted birth control to advance a controversial Negro project. You can just go and read in her autobiography that she spoke to KKK groups, and at least for a time, she advocated for eugenics. And the reason was the gradual suppression, elimination, and eventual extinction of defective stocks, those human weeds which threaten the blooming of the finest flowers of American civilization. Now, she may or may not have been referring to blacks there. There's certainly a strong connection because she was talking to the KKK, but she may have just been referring to poor people. We don't know. But that's what's in her autobiography. So how does the social justice movement respond to this? Well, confused. If you go to the Planned Parenthood website, this is just a statement that's there. And it just says that she had heroic accomplishments, but she was also complex and imperfect. And, that's true of all of us. But then they just mention that she was one of the most important people, 100 most important people in Time magazine's list for the 20th century in 1990. And she did so much to help women. And they do have a note on their website that says that they denounce that she talked to the KKK and that she participated in any of this eugenics stuff. And she actually did make a statement considerably later about eugenics that she thought that it should not be applied to target any particular race. But you can see the quandary here that they have. But what they have done is they have redefined the issue as not about abortion. Let's not talk about the fact that we aren't going to have all of these children who aren't born. Let's talk about access to abortion. That's the issue. Let's redefine it as having the power to choose. Because again, this was all about having the power, the policy. And right now you've got, some other group that's trying to impose their norms on them, but they need to have, this group, women, need to have the power to choose. And then finally, I think most ironically, they redefine a fetus as something that is subhuman. This is exactly the same justification that was used for slavery and for segregation. But you can see this quandary kind of play out in many different spheres for the social justice movement. And they'll just use the same sort of strategy. obfuscate, confuse the issue, and redefine things. What is it that we are really after? Like I said, when somebody just says social justice, you're like, oh yeah, I'm all for that. If you look it up in the dictionary, justice means the maintenance or administration of what is just, especially by the impartial adjustment of conflicting claims or the assignment of merited rewards or punishments. And of course, we're for that because God is for that. Just a few verses about that in Isaiah, it says, "For I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and wrong. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." And finally, out of Isaiah, "Behold, my servant Jesus, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations." I think it's really ironic that, what they want, what they say they want, justice, ultimately, Jesus Christ is the only one who can deliver. So, what are some strengths of critical theory? First, it does recognize that oppression is evil. When we started out, we talked about racism. It is evil. And here's just a selection of verses you can read on your own. I just want to emphasize this one that's right in the middle out of Proverbs, which is highlighted in bold. "Whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors him." Whatever the group is, if we're oppressing them, we're insulting the maker of that person. And who's the maker of all of us? It's God. Another strength is this idea of groups. First off, it does help us to understand that even though we have individuals, society is made up of groups. And there are laws and institutions that can promote sin or good behavior. So, just as they are trying to change policies, laws, and institutions, so are we. As Christians, we have tried to use those to further the the norms, the policies, that basically support the biblical worldview. And it can dramatically amplify and encourage either human wickedness or good behavior. So there's certainly slavery was codified in the United States at first. We already looked a little bit at the Holocaust and the policies that the Nazis had that led to that extermination. But one a lot of people don't think of is even things like the divine right of kings. The whole Middle Ages period, the Dark Ages, there was this divine right of kings that the royalty used to create a social hierarchy that couldn't be questioned, and therefore they could impose their will, their views, and the power. Also mentioned this idea of group experiences. Now, it's valid to a point. Again, I gave you the example of I'm a white male. I don't have the experience of a black woman who's had a child. And similarly, I'm not a soldier. And anybody who has fought in a war and seen a comrade die, he's got an experience that I just can't fully appreciate. So, there is some truth in this idea of group experiences. What is invalid is the idea that it gives them some almost supernatural insight into any and every situation, such that any thought that I've got is completely invalidated. Now, continuing with this idea of groups, God also deals with man as groups to some extent. What unites us the most? We are made in the image of God, but secondly, it's our sin. And here out of Romans 5, it says, Adam sinned, sin entered the world. Adam's sin brought death, so death spread to everyone. for everyone sinned. For the sin of this one man, Adam, caused death to rule over many. But even greater is God's wonderful grace and his gift of righteousness. For all who receive it will live in triumph over sin and death through this one man, Jesus Christ. One man sinned. All of humanity now shares in that sin, a group. And other examples of God dealing with groups. The nation of Israel, many times. This is a passage when the nation is about to enter into the promised land, and Moses has given them his final speech before that, and he's just warning them, assemble all the elders, the tribes, and I'm going to speak to them and just tell them that, God's already told me that you guys are going to fall away. You're going to become sinful. You're going to do what is evil in the sight of the Lord, and it's going to provoke him to anger, and he will bring about all these curses upon you, which happened. There's also the story in Joshua of Achan, the son of Zerah. They were told not to take any spoil when they conquered some of the cities. He did, and wrath fell on the whole congregation of Israel. So everybody paid for his sin. You can also think of when David numbered the people, and then he would give them the choice of what happened, and the angel of the Lord came in and started wiping them out. The nation paid. So God does sometimes deal with groups. So it also appropriately identifies this idea of hegemonic power. It does exist, and it has strong effects. Our norms, our values are often imposed or strongly influenced. And who of us wouldn't admit that Hollywood, movies, TV, music, and advertising firms, that they don't impose many of our social norms, including like a standard of beauty? That's an example of that hegemonic power. And examples out of the Bible, the Pharisees, they were getting on Jesus because his disciples didn't do this hand washing before they ate. They imposed that norm. You had to do that before you ate. And again, it's just an example of power in action. So what's the danger? Well, the real problem is it's a morally bankrupt worldview. God's not at the top. It doesn't even have a creation narrative. There's no transcendent creator. There's no purpose for mankind. There's no design for us. There's no value in us. We're just part of a group. And our identity is only defined in terms of those groups: race, class, sexuality, age, ability, and gender. It also makes this oppression our fundamental problem, not our sin. And it's the oppression that we feel. It's not even the oppression that we give. So yes, the oppression that I give, that I participate in, that's part of my sin. But here it's the exact opposite. My problem is somebody else oppressing me. It's their sin. And the solution is activism to change these power structures and to raise awareness, to overthrow and dismantle the hegemonic power. It's to work for the liberation of all oppressed groups so we can achieve a state of equity of outcome. But the reality is this is unachievable by human power. What they don't realize is they're really seeking Jesus and his kingdom. When he read out of the book of Isaiah, he read this passage and then said, "In your hearing, this is fulfilled." And what he said was he came to proclaim that the captives will be released, that the blind will see, the oppressed will be set free, and the time of the Lord's favor has come. What is all of this about? It's about captives wanting to be released. It's about the oppressed wanting to be set free. Jesus Christ is the answer to all of their problems. They just don't realize it. So where does critical theory lead? Well, inevitably, it's going to erode biblical truths. And here are just some examples. So moral imperatives, like you shouldn't hit people with bike locks. So there's actually an example where somebody who taught ethics in a university hit somebody with a bike lock because they were a Trump supporter. But that was considered to be okay because hitting somebody was less important than the abstract goal of resisting oppression. And this person was a Trump supporter. Let's hit a little closer to home. Here is a tweet from Union Theological Seminary from 2018. We deny the Bible is inerrant or infallible because it reflects both God's truth and human sin and prejudice. They're buying into this hegemonic power, the old white men trying to impose their norms on us, not just God's. So now we can use biblical scholarship and critical theory to help us discern which messages are God's. So basically, they've given themselves the license to go and cut the Bible up, discard what they don't like, and just keep the rest. Same thing that Thomas Jefferson did. Now here's a quote from Jemar Tisby in a Twitter post. So he's the one that has on Right Now Media the series called The Color of Compromise, which is based on the book that he wrote. And a lot of it is just historical information, and it's most, from what I've seen, is pretty accurate. It does document complicity of the church, at the very least, in not stopping a lot of the behavior that's in there. But here in this tweet, he says, whiteness also wants to invalidate your experiences and insights about race under the veneer of detached empirical inquiry. It tries to add to the burden of Black people to prove our own oppression rather than holding the oppressors accountable. These are the key concepts in critical theory. Only the oppressed can have experiences and insights that are valid. It's not about objective reality and truth. And it's all about holding the oppressors, those with the hegemonic power, accountable so that we can create the equitable world. Further examples of how it just distracts. There's a website for Faithful America. I've got the link here. And they advertise themselves as the largest online group of Christians putting faith into action for social justice. What are the great acts that they have done? They fought fracking. They helped students win justice for a fired gay principal. They pressured MSNBC to drop the Family Research Council because they were Family Research Council was supporting the nuclear family. And likewise, they convinced Google to drop World Vision because they were also being exclusive of, LGBTQ. There's nothing here about the gospel, the true gospel. And really, this is an ancient fight, okay? It used to be called the social gospel. And the counter to that was called fundamentalism. And here you had the main goal to relieve physical suffering. And yes, this is important, and we need to be about that work. And I will admit that many people who were in the fundamentalist movement simply ignored this. But the problem is, it's just so much easier to just concentrate on relieving the physical suffering because the sinner gladly embraces you. But when you confront people with their sin, that's hard. And so if you go and look at those churches that have emphasized the social gospel, They've done this drift. They've lost the fundamentals, just like we previously saw, where they cut the Bible up, only keep what they want. So what we have to do is meet people's physical needs, but not at the expense of dropping the truth in the gospel. And if you want to see where this heads, just look at Europe. They did this. They're about 20 years ahead of us, and their churches are nearly empty, and many of ours are headed the same way. So we just need to emphasize what Jesus said. He is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. Even if we alleviate a little bit of current physical suffering, we're not alleviating eternal suffering. So let's talk a little bit more about this truth. The Bible tells us God defines absolute truth, and that's an anchor. It doesn't sway back and forth. It's always there. So we can use reason and logic and argument to test claims against available evidence to determine truth. Now, ultimately, Scripture is the ultimate truth test. But we can also use our minds, reason, and logic to assess whether policies are truly arbitrary or they're abusive, and that's what we need to do. Many of the policies are not good, okay? And they need to be reassessed. But we should be using reason and logic to do that assessment, not simply people's experiences. Experiences are anecdotal. You tend to need data that has a statistical significance. But the problem is that this critical theory just assumes that all of the truth claims of anybody who isn't the oppressed, they're just veiled bids for power. They ask, well, what incentives does this person have to make this claim? What's their political agenda? How does the statement function to preserve their power or their privilege? And I wish these people in the university would go walk down to the philosophy department, because all of the problems with their theory are well known in philosophy departments. And C.S. Lewis introduced the term Bulverism, which means a logical fallacy that dismisses a claim as false because of the assumed motives of the person making the claim. So it's been around a long time that we've known that this is a logical fallacy. But they still just focus on group identity and what they want to hear. And if somebody is a member of an oppressed group, and yet they support a policy of the oppressor, the hegemonic power group, it's just, they've internalized their oppression. They're so thoroughly immersed in the dominant power structure that they cannot recognize it. They need to be awakened. And today in critical race theory, blacks will refer to these people as Uncle Toms, sometimes shortened to Tom. It's a derogatory epithet for an exceedingly subservient person or house Negro, particularly one aware of their own lower class racial status. And I think it's kind of ironic that they chose that term, because Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom, is probably one of the most important reasons that the Civil War occurred, because it was so popular and it changed the minds of so many people in the North about slavery. And yet now it's an epithet. Now, the primary concern for people who have embraced this theory, it's not reason, it's not argument, it's not evidence, and it's definitely not scripture. It's unearthing and deconstructing the hidden motives of their opponents, so that according to their theory, their claims can be ignored. That's the box they try to stick you in. What are some problems? it promotes adversarial relations. Remember, it's got this binary. You've got the oppressor and the oppressed, the victims. And, if you feel that you're just a victim and you're just always abused, that is going to promote unrest within you. And this theory doesn't offer you any means to achieve harmony and equity. It just tells you to try and get the power, to get the policies changed, to get things that you want. And it does rely on this kind of idea out of Marxist philosophy. You have to do it through the state because the state imposes all of the policy. But in Marxist philosophy, you had to have a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat before you could finally achieve the utopia of communism. And the communist countries that we have today, they're all still in the temporary dictatorship, and we all know how wonderful they are going for the population. But the same thing would be true, in those countries. It's an economic system, but it wouldn't matter what sort of system you're talking about. And some of these books literally talk about having a constitutional amendments, and instead of a Department of Homeland Security, you have a Department of Anti-Racism that will impose all of these new policies to make sure that nobody's being racist. And I'm sure that's going to work just about as well. And in the meantime, it just breeds discontent. People are just trying to escape the oppressors without any solution. And I would say, even if in some magical world they could achieve equity in outcome, satisfaction, peace, and harmony is not going to come with it. Because all it would be doing is achieving equity and outcome for groups that they've identified. There's going to be others that are still marginalized. There's always going to be fighting for power. But in contrast, the Bible teaches that all humans are united in our creation, in the image of God, in our sin, in our need for a Savior. The Bible begins with creation, and that is crucial to our worldview. We are made in the image of God, and we are sinful, condemned already. That sin came through Adam, spread to all of us. The wages of that sin is death, but if we believe, we will be justified and saved. So another problem with critical theory is, although it identifies that hegemonic power exists, its goal is to get rid of all hegemonic power. And it views singularly these narratives and these values and norms as inherently oppressive. But the Bible is nothing but a big hegemonic discourse from start to finish. God is the all-powerful one in the universe. He has told the true story of reality, and he imposes his religion, his morality, his ideas of sexuality, his ideas of gender. The two are at complete odds. It also has an issue with inequality. This idea of designating some individuals as oppressed and others as oppressors leads the theorists to insist on a moral asymmetry between these groups, which we've already seen this at work. An oppressed person can say or do something demonstrating bias or prejudice, preference, discrimination, hatred, but not be racist, because racism is oppression, doing one of these sorts of actions, holding prejudice, plus power. But if they've got no power, they can do whatever they want, and they're not a racist. Now, I will say that not everyone completely holds to this view. It is part of critical theory, but people like Ibram Kennedy, he will readily admit that anybody can be racist. But most hold to this. They also say that the underlying power structure in American society is what differentiates behavior from actual racism. So those with power are racist. Those without power can't be racist. It's the power structure that defines who can be a racist. But the Bible emphasizes we're all equal under the law. And James tells us the person who keeps all of the laws except one is guilty. It is as guilty as the person who has broken all of God's laws. So we're all the same. And sin, what is it? It's really a violation of God's commands, whether it be in thought, in word, or deed. And it's regardless of who is doing it. It doesn't matter how much power you have. If you break God's commands, you've committed a sin. Critical theory also emphasizes power imbalances. So just some thought questions. What is your response to the following claims? Should we reject capitalism because it perpetuates economic privilege? Should we reject male eldership because it perpetuates male privilege? Should we reject traditional marriage because it perpetuates heteronormativity? Should we reject the connection between sex and gender because it perpetuates cisgender privilege? Should we stop preaching about the biblical morality or about the exclusivity of Christ so that non-Christians aren't marginalized? If you insist that all power imbalances are bad, you basically have to throw out our core beliefs. There are serious repercussions for our theology. So what are we to do? Seek peace. That's my answer. These people who are promoting social justice, critical theory, they're still human beings. And we do need to understand where they're coming from so that we can have meaningful conversations with them and point them to the truth. And as I've mentioned several times during this discourse, I think that they're really looking for Jesus. He's the only one that can bring them justice. He's the only one that can stop the oppression. So I just admonish you to follow this command here. Let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding, because many of the issues that they are raising are ones we need to address. And that will, if we work on that, we can lead to some mutual upbuilding. But finally, I want to unequivocally acknowledge God's the true power. I'm not going to stray from saying he is the hegemonic power, and I willingly acquiesce to that. I think that's part of the problem in this whole thing of critical theory. It doesn't allow for basically benevolent power. Why are we willing to accept God? Because we believe he has our best interests, because he knows more than we do. He's the benevolent dictator. He's the answer to Marxism. The Marxists have to have this dictatorship. The only way you can have a non-oppressive and positive experience during that totalitarian regime is if you have somebody like Jesus who's leading it. So I, just like the Bible says, say that the Lord is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. For all that is in heaven and in the earth is thine. Thine is the kingdom, O Lord, and thou art exalted as head above all. And out of Psalms, we speak the glory of thy kingdom and talk of thy power. And then finally, as Jesus taught us to pray, Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.